Okay, welcome back. So this is number two. This is U.S. and world affairs leading up to Second World War. So we're talking about the period of the 1920s through to December 7th, 1941. So this includes material in your book in Chapter 34, but you have to have the larger view. Again, AP is not asking you about what's in this chapter. AP is asking you about understanding the history behind it. So we've talked so far a great deal about the domestic situation in the United States, the 20s, 30s, what was going on inside the United States economically and so on. So let's talk about the United States' situation with regard to the rest of the world. Okay. So we'll take it. We'll start with doing it sort of by region, and let's start with Latin America. Latin America, the key term of this period is the good neighbor policy, which is what it was called under Franklin Delano Roosevelt when it became much more explicit. But this had already started under Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, the Republicans who had been president in the 1920s. What's it about? If we remember, from the time of McKinley on, you had the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, you had the big stick policy, Taft, you had the dollar diplomacy policy, and even in Wilson's case, although Wilson, wanted to have this foreign policy based on sort of moral suasion, moral pressure, even Wilson gave in and had a similar kind of policy. They were all about using U.S. military power and a kind of financial coercion to control Central America, the Caribbean, Latin America generally. Yeah, with McKinley, we actually had armed intervention in the Spanish-American War. With Teddy Roosevelt, you always had the military there, taking Panama and so on. Taft used a kind of financial coercion with that dollar diplomacy stuff, making these countries dependent on U.S. banks. But in the end, he always backed it up with the U.S. Marines. And even Wilson, who, as I said, wanted to use moral authority, used the military on occasion down there. By the time you get to the 1920s, after the First World War, Warren Harding, and then Coolidge, and then Hoover, without sort of declaring what they're doing, just sort of back off on a lot of the military intervention that they were doing. And by the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes along, FDR, he is openly renouncing armed intervention in Latin America. So more about making them our good buddies and neighbors rather than trying to use force against them. That doesn't mean that we didn't stop our commercial involvement down there. American companies still owned vast chunks of Central America. The United Fruit Company, for instance, was still the biggest player in Central America, and U.S. financial interests, banks, and so on, were clearly, important chunks of the economy of these Latin American countries. But it was more about pursuing commercial involvement than using financial force, and certainly military force at this time. Just as the look ahead there, it would lead to Roosevelt trying to unite the Western Hemisphere, that is both North and South America, against fascism, which is not as obvious as it seems. I mean, we forget that, we just look back on Hitler, for instance, as this sort of unmitigated, unmixed horror. But he was not necessarily viewed that way in the rest of the world. He was the guy who would rebuild Germany from nothing, and he had a lot of admirers in Argentina, Buenos Aires. There was already a large German expatriate community in some of these countries. So, you can't simply take for granted that, of course, everybody was going to be on our side moving into World War II. But Roosevelt certainly wanted to keep friendly relations with our neighbors to the south, and there was a lot of effort that went into that. Film crews were sent down there, for instance, um, to engage in cultural relations. If you look at the movies of the period of the 1930s and into the 40s, there's lots of South American references. Uh, um, the Some of the great movies of the 30s were set in Mexico or set in Rio de Janeiro. Fred Astaire's, one of his first big movies, was flying down to Rio, and Cuba was, you know, the Disneyland of its time. That was the great exotic tourist destination. So there's a lot of attempt to build solidarity, if you will, there, even culturally. Okay, that moves us then next to Asia. And Asia was a complicated situation. What was going on in Asia was Japan. Um, Japan had its own racial attitudes. We tend to forget this because, again, we Americans, many of us, focus on Europe. But if you look back at what was going on in Japan in the late 1800s, early 20th century, you had this reemergence of Japanese national identity that parallels very closely what happened in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Japan, you had gone through a series of changes in emperors over there, and there was a real resurgence of pride in Japanese culture, not sort of trying to imitate the West or ape the West. And the Japanese really believed themselves to be a master race. The emperor, as you may know, was viewed in religious terms in the Shinto religion as being the intermediary between human beings and the gods. He was, in a certain sense, although this is also theologically complicated, viewed as a god himself and a descendant of the sun god. And the people of Japan were therefore the highest form of human beings. They, you know, if you get into the story of World War II in Asia, which we're not really going to, but some of you may be interested, you have to understand that. Because this was not just a war over territory or economic growth between countries that happen to be arbitrarily divided, the way it is between, say, France and Germany. The Japanese looked at Chinese and Koreans as subhuman. And this is why later in the war you will get some really horrific atrocities. I mean, things that would make Adolf Hitler's eyes water with pride went on over in Asia, perpetrated by certain elements of the Japanese military, particularly against Koreans and against the Chinese. So there was this powerful racial attitude over there. That's in the background at this point. We don't really, just something to know there. The other thing you want to realize is that there were practical issues here. Japan is an island country. It has great seafood, and that's about it in the sense of natural resources. It really is reliant on its trading partners for a lot of things. They were looking to grow their economy into a fully modern industrial economy, and they were well on their way to do that. But to do that, what do you need? Well, you need iron so that you can make steel. You need coal so that you can make steel and other things. You need oil, petroleum, so that you can fuel your airplanes and so on. Ships were beginning to go to oil engines and like that. You need rubber, important industrial thing. I mean, not just for tires, but for a lot of other applications. Use rubber for and electricity and so on. So that's a crucial element as well. So they wanted to get their hands on a good, steady supply of all of those things, and they had long wanted a big piece of the mainland. When you're an island, island countries often lust after having a chunk of the mainland, and they wanted a big chunk of China and felt that they were entitled to it. They felt that they had ancient claims and rights to it. By the time we get to the 1920s, therefore, the U.S., the U.K., and Japan are the three biggest players in the East. China is kind of a mess. China is undergoing its own series of civil wars, and in many ways very backward country, at least economically, industrially. The other countries of the area, in Southeast Asia, for instance, what's called French Indochina, which will later become Vietnam and Cambodia and all that. These are countries that have really been left behind by industrialization. So the United States, which, don't forget, has the Philippines, the UK, which has Hong Kong and the largest fleet in the world, and Japan, which is really the industrial power in the area, these are really the players in the East. Now let's just take a quick look at a map, because it's easy to sort of, again, as Americans, particularly as New Yorkers, we just sort of think of all of that's just sort of being over there someplace. But this is where it is. There's the Philippine Islands, which are U.S. territory at the time. British Malaya, the British owned Burma and all down into here. The Dutch owned the Dutch West Indies, which is now today Indonesia, this is called. The French were here in what's called French Indochina, which is today Vietnam and Laos and a piece of Cambodia there. But the British really were between Burma and then India, which is sort of off the screen here as a base. Australia is down below the Dutch East Indies here. So the British really have big interests here. U.S. owns the Philippines, and the Micronesia, the Marshall Islands here, these are all U.S. territory. There's not much to them. They're a bunch of little teeny tiny little islands, but the United States has place over here. Hawaii is over off the screen over to the right. But so you see U.S. and Great Britain are real players here. I should point out, by the way, that the Dutch East Indies is very, very important because they are full of oil and rubber. And there's the Philippine Islands, U.S. standing right in the way of them. Huh? Okay. China, we see up here, right? And the USSR. Korea is a protectorate that really is just overrun by the Japanese at a certain point. So this is the world that the Japanese are looking at, and they're looking to expand into all of this. They'd also like to expand down here. We'll get to it, but one of the things people forget is that the same day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippine Islands. They went after Guam. They went after Midway, which is over a bit. And they would eventually take over this northern area of the Dutch East Indies and move all the way over into what was called the hump over by the Himalayan mountains. Okay, so anyway, let's continue. So the Japanese are looking to expand. U.S., U.K., and Japan are the three big powers in the East, and they're in an arms race. They are building ships like crazy, trying to outdo each other, and it's becoming an issue because it's starting to bankrupt them. So in the under the Harding administration in 1921, you had this event called the Washington Naval Conference. This is important. The AP likes to ask questions about this. The Washington Naval Conference was a gathering of leaders from all over the world to talk about the growing issues and tensions over in Asia. And specifically, it was about the U.S., U.K., Japan arms race. Everybody comes to an agreement at the Washington Naval Conference. The upshot of it is that the three big powers agree to limit the construction of battleships and aircraft carriers to a ratio of 5 to 5 to 3. That is, for every 3 ships that the Japanese have, the U.S. and the U.K. will each get 5. It gives the U.S. and the U.K. dominance, but it means that they're not sort of ridiculously outstripping Japan. I point out here, aircraft carriers, watch that. The war in the Pacific, the Second World War, it will largely be an air war. Airplanes were used for the first time in combat significantly in World War I. They didn't have a lot of effect on the war. There are a lot of great stories from World War I, the Red Baron and all that, which are all true. But those were fighter pilots fighting among fighter pilots. It really didn't affect the war on the ground. In the 1920s and then into the 30s, they begin to understand the possibilities of aircraft, particularly using them to bomb and using them for reconnaissance. When you're out at sea, once you get past about 20 miles, or I should say if you're on a ship, if you're on a battleship, you can see about 20 miles distance. Once you get past about 20 miles, the curvature of the Earth makes it impossible for you to see past that. So a battleship of the period, one of the Dreadnought class battleships, their guns, the 16 inches, 15 inches, would have an effective range of 20, 24 miles. So you could not see past the maximum range of your guns, and in fact, the maximum range of your guns was longer than your actual ability to see. So having an airplane that you can send up off of the deck of your ship to go up high and see farther, and then maybe buzz around a little bit, go out a few miles, that can give you a crucial advantage. And they were beginning to figure out that an airplane with some well-placed bombs, one airplane could wipe out an entire battleship. So there were hints beginning to come along that the next war would be fought by airplanes. So aircraft carriers, therefore, were becoming increasingly important, along with the traditional large battleships. Anyway, the Washington Naval Conference, everybody agrees to this sort of arms limitation. Japan also promised that it would respect the territorial integrity of China, and everybody agrees, Japan in particular agrees to the open door policy that we've seen before. That's great in the 1920s, but the Great Depression hit Japan as hard or harder than it hit the West. They were as affected by it. It was, it's what I said to you once in class. The Great Depression was not an American event. It was a worldwide event. It had different forms in different places, lasted different amounts of time, but it affected everybody. When the Great Depression hit Japan, one of the things that happens is the government goes into the hands of militarists. That is to say, the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, was the emperor and theoretically a god. But in fact, he had almost no practical ability to govern. It's a very odd thing, perhaps to us. In part, it's because of his sacredness and his isolation. Nobody saw the emperor. The emperor lived in his own little complex, his own village. There were only a handful of people that were allowed to see him, and therefore he didn't have contact with the outside world and couldn't enforce a lot of authority. When it's a story for later on, you may have heard it, but it is actually true. When the atomic bombs struck Japan, the emperor went on the air, he went on the radio to explain to his people that they had been hit by this, strange new weapon, and that they were therefore being forced to surrender. There were people who wept for the surrender, but who also wept in overwhelming emotion because it was the first time they had heard the sound of the God Emperor's voice. Well, that can give you a great deal of authority, but it can also mean that you're so isolated that your government is really in the hands of other people. And Hirohito's government was in the hands of a handful of ministers, including his prime minister, who eventually, the prime minister's Hideki Tojo. They won't ask you that on AP, but these were guys who came out of the military. Effectively, in 1931, the imperial diet, the imperial parliament of Japan, puts into office these extremist believers in turning Japan into a completely militarized society. Everybody being part of the military, everybody being part of the war machine, in order that these sacred people might conquer the world. And they really believe that. And how much the emperor was involved in any decision making at all is still a matter of some dispute after 31. They really take the reins of government largely out of his hands. That's not to say he wasn't sympathetic to it or didn't go along with it, but he was not, the emperor was not the mastermind of the whole operation the way, say, Hitler was in Germany. In any event, in 1931, the government of Japan goes into the hands of these militarists, and one of the first things they do is invade Manchuria. Manchuria is a section, that section of Japan up in the of China up in the north. Okay, Manchuria is up here. It's up in this section up here, by Harbin and all this. And the Japanese had long claimed the right to this. They claimed the right to this whole region. So they simply invaded and took it, and actually set up their own country there. They claimed that they were not conquering it, that they were liberating it as Manchu Kuo, and they installed an emperor in Manchuria. And the emperor they installed was the ex-emperor of China. If you've ever seen the movie, some of you may have, called The Last Emperor of China, it's a somewhat Hollywoodized but largely true story. The revolutions around World War I had isolated the emperor in the Forbidden City, this palace complex in Peking, while the rest of the country was completely lost to him. He lived in this fictional world where the country was really run by warlords, and as long as the emperor stayed holed up in his palace, nobody bothered him. Then he was deposed, and so in the 1920s was basically kicked out of Peking, and then the Japanese sort of seduced him or bribed him or appealed to his greed, depending on how you want to interpret it, into becoming emperor of this puppet state of Manchuria. Eventually that guy, by the way, after the war, was put on trial by the new Chinese Communist government and lived out his life as a gardener, basically forgotten by everybody around him. But so the Japanese had set up this Manchuria up here, and why do they want Manchuria? Because Manchuria is full of iron and full of coal. So that's really what they were going for. Now, why is all that? Because it's the first step that Japan is making into what's going to be World War II. They invade Manchuria. China is deadly weak due to its own internal problems. They now have access to all this iron and coal. They have set up this puppet state up there. Henry Stimson, who was the United States Secretary of State in 1931 under Herbert Hoover, yes, president. He was Secretary of State under Hoover. Announces that the United States is refusing to recognize the legitimacy of Japan's occupation of Manchuria, or this new country that they've set up of Manchuria. That's referred to as the Stimson Doctrine. By the way, Henry Stimson will come back later. Even though he's a Republican, in 1940 he will get picked up by FDR as his Secretary of War, that is the head of the Department of the Army. Anyway, all of this is important. The Washington Naval Conference is important to know, and the Stimson Doctrine is important to know, because it's just the beginning. Once they have Manchuria, Japan is then going to start to move. 1936, it renounced the Washington Naval Conference agreements that it made, and it starts to build up its navy. In that same year, it also leaves the League of Nations. And in 1937, it invades, I say, China itself. That is, it moves from Manchuria, this disputed province, into what we would call mainland China. It does that. It violates the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, which you should know from your books, which outlawed all aggressive wars. So really, World War II doesn't start with Pearl Harbor, and it doesn't start with Hitler invading Poland in 1939. It really starts in 1937 in Asia, with Japan invading China proper, and you can push it to 1931 in Asia with Japan invading Manchuria. So that's the situation so far. With Latin America, the United States is pursuing good neighbor policy. With Asia, the United States is watching as Japan becomes increasingly militant, increasingly expansive, and breaks through these attempts to limit their militarism or to contain their expansionism. Okay, let's take a look at U.S. relations then with what's going on in Europe. Okay, World War I. Obviously, U.S. played a big part in World War I. And after the war, the Dawes Plan, we've mentioned in class, I think we've mentioned in class, certainly in your book, where the U.S. uses its economic power to try to rescue Germany during that 1923 hyperinflation period. So the U.S. is involved in Europe for sure, and has become an international player in a way it wasn't in the 1800s. But notice, the United States never joined the League of Nations. Why? Washington's farewell address said, "Don't get entangled in European affairs." That Washington's farewell address is an important thread through all of American foreign policy. By the 1930s, so we're now into, getting into the 20s and into the 30s, you have this growing American resentment over World War One. And I kind of have it backwards here, but don't forget, that song we talked about, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? It starts off with the guy saying, listen, I put on a khaki suit, I put on uniform and went off and fought, and now everybody's forgotten me. And people looked at World War One, and a lot of them said, what did we get for it? My brother's dead, my kid's dead, my uncle's dead. The ones who aren't dead came home wounded, missing limbs, missing an eye, or gassed. There were settlements out in the West, down in Arizona and stuff. A lot of the guys who suffered injuries from the gas warfare, nobody really knew what to do with them. So it was thought, well, if we put them out in very dry climate, that'll be good for them maybe. But so we wind up with dead kids, wounded kids, and a depression. That's what we get for our involvement in this war. The European countries are never going to pay the war debt that they still owe us. We lent them all of this huge amounts of money they never paid back, which is true. So, what did we get out of this, and why did this happen anyway? And people, of course, they're in the midst of the Depression. They're looking around for people to blame. It's very hard when you have these kinds of disasters for people not to think that there must be an explanation for it beyond just, stuff happens. Life is hard. The world is unpredictable. That's not good enough. People want to pin the blame on somebody. For positive motives, because they want to make sure it never happens again. For negative motives, just because they want somebody to, punch in the face. So you get this character of Senator Gerald Nye. Nye was a Republican from North Dakota. Notice, out in the Midwest, heartland, populism, all that stuff. And also North Dakota, a place that doesn't have a lot of industry. Farmland, but not a lot of industry. It's easy to blame industrialists if nobody in your constituency had a job working in a munitions factory. Interesting. Anyway, he holds a series of hearings. The Senate convenes hearings. They pull in a bunch of people. They put them under oath. They get testimony, and he issues a report that concludes that the United States was tricked into entering the war by greedy arms manufacturers. The guys who made munitions, who made the bullets, who made the guns, who sold supplies to the military, they all of these people who made money on the war profiteers, they really were the ones who tricked the U.S. into getting involved so that they'd have a big market to sell their stuff. This is what he comes up with. That argument gets a lot of traction. I'm not saying that Gerald Nye becomes, everybody's favorite politician, but that sort of mentality is reflective of how a lot of people felt at the period. What the hell is the point of war? War is about a bunch of rich guys getting richer and a bunch of poor guys losing their sons. That's kind of how it gets viewed. And so there is an intense isolationism that develops. I would also point out, I didn't put this here, but use your heads, right, psychologically. The First World War was fought between the German Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire versus the Russian Empire, the King of Italy, the King of England, and this fuzzy notion of the French Republic. It was this mess of these ancient feuds between various Europeans. I mean, for heaven's sake, you guys know, you remember Euro, you did Global. The war gets triggered because the Serbians have a beef, the Serbians who have a beef against the Austrians, so they take it out on a guy in Bosnia, places most Americans hadn't the faintest interest in. We fight the war to make the world safe for democracy. That's what Woodrow Wilson said. Right? Go over there, fight the war, fix it all up, Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations, all of that, blah, blah, blah. And now you get into the 30s, late 30s, and they're all going to go to war again. So, we went over there and settled things for them once. Why would we go over there now a second time? If these Europeans can't govern themselves, can't get their act together, can't stop killing themselves, why the hell should I give my life to help them settle their hash when it gets nothing for the United States and we don't really have an involvement in it? Now, again, hear me. I am not making that argument. I am not making that case. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm not saying I would agree with it or disagree with it at the time. That's for historians to sift out. That's for you to sift out. I am pointing out that that's how a lot of people felt. And perception, kids, is its own reality. People act upon what they perceive to be the truth. It is our hope that we try to discover what really is true. But in fact, most people go on their perception of truth. And that was people's perception of truth. Look at this. We had gotten involved in Europe once, and what did it accomplish? Nothing. They're right back ready to kill each other. And all we got out of it was a depression. That's how people felt. And Nye proves that this war was only fought to make a handful of arms manufacturers richer. Okay, so we have this intense isolationism, and this is what it's known as at the time, isolationism. Congress passes, therefore, in the 30s, a bunch of laws that are collectively referred to as the Neutrality Acts. They're really a separate set of laws. It did things like it banned loans to nations who were at war. So you couldn't give U.S. money or U.S. bank money to countries so that they could fight a war. It banned the sales of armaments to nations that are at war. Why do this? Because you were trying to prevent the mistakes and the tricks that got the U.S. into World War I. So the Neutrality Acts were supposed to prevent that from happening again. And they were pretty popular. Up until Pearl Harbor, at least 80% of Americans thought the U.S. should have nothing whatever to do with the war. So right up until Pearl Harbor. I just point out here, to give you an idea of how people were feeling, you had the America First Committee, which was telling people to stay out of the war. These were mostly right-wing types, not necessarily nuts, but Republican, right-of-center types. And you had the Keep America Out of War Committee on the left. And they were both very active right up until Pearl Harbor. It was really only Pearl Harbor that completely turned the country's head around. All right, so what happens then? Whether we like it or not, whether we're remaining neutral or not, over in Europe, war comes. September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland. So what's the U.S. going to do? Well, the U.S. is going to stay out of it, but they are going to protect us. Congress approves the Selective Service Act. We've seen selective service before. It just means the draft. In 1940. Every guy got or what they did was, they picked at random, and you can see this, there's actually newsreel video movies of Stimson, who by this time was Secretary of War, with the drawing of the lottery. What they did was they picked numbers randomly out of a fishbowl and assigned them to birth dates. So there's a big calendar, right? and you pick a number out, and number is 156. And so 156 became whatever, January 1st. And then everybody born that day, that was how you got picked up for the draft. It was the first peacetime draft in the history of the United States. We're not at war. So why are we drafting guys? To make sure we never do go to war, to protect America, to turn us into an impregnable fortress. Nobody would attack. Congress approves new budget for the military by 500%. We go from $2 billion a year to $10 billion a year, which is a lot of money today. At the time, it was astronomical. Unheard of. $10 billion a year. It is not about going to war, though. Understand that. 1940, the draft and the increase in the military budget, both of which are important, are not about us getting ready to go to war. It's about us making the U.S. so strong that we won't have to go to war. Nobody will attack us because we're just going to turn the U.S. into this gigantic fortress. Well, that's not really Roosevelt's idea. Roosevelt was already personally on the side of the Allies and wanted to help Britain. I don't throw in here, and I forget if your book even mentions it, but it's an interesting little story. The King and Queen of England, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. This is not Elizabeth II. The current Queen in England is Elizabeth II. She was a very young girl at this time, but this is her mother, Queen Elizabeth and King George. They were a pretty young couple. They had Elizabeth II was their oldest, and she was, I don't know, maybe I'd have to even check now. I should check. Hang on. Yeah, she was very young. She was just barely 13 in 1939. But in 1939, King George and Queen Elizabeth, young married couple, come over to America. Roosevelt invites the two of them to come to America to make a royal visit. And he orchestrates the whole thing. Roosevelt orchestrates the whole thing. They come, they visit a few sites in America, they greet the crowds, they go up to Roosevelt's own personal family home in Hyde Park, New York, up on the Hudson, where he holds a picnic for them, and they are filmed for the newsreel cameras enjoying Nathan's hot dogs. Roosevelt intentionally does all of this specifically to make them as regular folks to the American people as possible, because already in 1939, when he sets up this visit, he wants very badly for the United States to help Britain as it is facing the possibility of war with Germany. And so this is all about that. Roosevelt is already thinking in those terms. Once Hitler actually invades Poland and Britain is now at war, he wants to help, but how can he do it? So he goes to Congress, Roosevelt does, and gets Congress to agree first to the cash and carry policy. A reluctant Congress went along with this. A country could come to the United States and buy weapons, food, supplies, if they paid in cash. Now, couldn't extend them credit. This was not going to be a long-term arrangement. You show up with cash, we will give you what you buy. And you send your own ship, not an American ship that could get torpedoed with Americans on it. You send your own ship to pick it up, load the supplies, and take it off right away. Congress went along with this. By 1940, Roosevelt is sort of stretching the cash and carry policy to give 50 destroyers. Destroyers are, I don't know if you guys, how much you guys know about the Navy, but destroyers are smallish battleships that are important for protecting your convoys. Shipping went back and forth across the Atlantic. Well, it went back and forth across the Atlantic. You had whole groups of ships going together. The Germans had lots of submarines, and the submarines would pick off these merchant ships. They would also pick off battleships and other things. Destroyers are smaller battleships that are very swift and that are specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. So they could detect the submarine, and then they'd sail over the top of the submarine and drop bombs out the side called depth charges to try to sink the submarine. So they were very important types of ships. Roosevelt finds a way to, quote, sell 50 destroyers to Britain. The British paid for these by giving the U.S. access to its naval bases in Latin America that the British didn't really need anyway. So Roosevelt is already moving in this direction. The next step up from the cash and carry was Lend-Lease. By the end of 1940, this is December of 1940, Roosevelt recognizes that cash and carry is not enough, that the British need more aid to fight the Germans, and by this time the Soviet Union has switched sides. Originally, you know from Euro, the Soviets were on Hitler's side, and then they switch. And so Roosevelt wants to supply the Brits and the Russians, so he comes up with this Lend-Lease idea. December of 1940, so right at the end of 1940, he gives another one of his fireside chats. These are these radio performances he does, where he just sits and talks to Americans like, hey, folks sitting around the kitchen table. And he uses this phrase: the United States has to be the arsenal of democracy. Important phrase to know. And important to realize that that phrase, arsenal of democracy, leads you directly to Lend-Lease, which you know about Lend-Lease from your textbooks. The United States is going to be providing the supplies to these people. Now, what does that arsenal of democracy thing do? Remember, it sets you up again for good versus evil. It's the good, pro-democratic British and the pro-democratic French and the pro-democratic Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, one of the world's worst dictators? Huh? Well, don't ask too many questions. We're in the middle of a war. It's good versus evil, and it's us good allies against the forces of anti-democratic fascism. And so we have to supply supplies to the people who are fighting the good fight over there, even if we're not actually fighting that fight with them. So the U.S. is going to be the arsenal of democracy. Lend-Lease, Congress allows Roosevelt to equip these countries on the excuse that any country that's vital to the United States interest, by which Roosevelt means Britain, and also Russia and, the French resistance and whoever else. You want to know when the Depression ends? This is when the Depression ends. Now that the doors have sort of been opened up to the United States to supply this need in this war, U.S. industry roars to life, ramps up production. It starts sucking in guys off the street. Between this and the Selective Service, the draft, which is already underway, draft has not reached its height yet, but it's already underway. Unemployment sinks like a stone. Now you need all hands on deck. You have more jobs than you have people for. That's going to start to draw women into the workforce, for instance, because they need, normally you have too many people, too few jobs. So how do we expand the number of jobs? Here you have too many jobs, too few people. How do we expand the number of people? Well, we take people who don't traditionally have jobs, like women, and pull them into the workforce. It also gave Britain and its allies, by this time the Soviet Union, almost unlimited supplies. But it's also going to put the United States in a position where it's not declared war, but it's supplying the enemies of the Axis of Germany and Italy and Japan. So we are effectively at war, which you can see that there's a sort of inevitability that we're going to get caught up in this thing. Okay, we'll pick it up there with the U.S. actually in the war and its aftermath next time.